4 bullets ripped through Gate 7. The man who fell didn't scream, didn't beg. He just smiled and whispered 6 words that made every officer go pale. "Tell General Whitmore I kept my promise." Nobody knew what that meant. Not yet. But 12 minutes later, when military Blackhawks descended on the precinct and a 3-star general stepped out demanding answers, everything changed. See, what Officer Brandon Cole didn't know when he pulled that trigger was that the suspicious vagrant he just shot had a Medal of Honor hidden in his backpack, a direct line to the Pentagon, and a secret so classified that even the police chief wasn't cleared to hear it. By the time they checked his fingerprints, it was already too late. The man bleeding out on those marble floors wasn't just any veteran. He was the veteran. The one they call when governments fall and hostages need saving. And now, he was down, which meant somebody had exactly 47 minutes to explain why before the entire military justice system came crashing down. This is what happens when you shoot a ghost, a legend, a man who technically doesn't exist. December 18th, 2024, Los Angeles Union Station, rush hour, thousands of commuters, 1 decorated Marine, and a security checkpoint that would trigger a national crisis. What started as a routine bag check ended with a Purple Heart recipient bleeding on marble floors while his phone recorded everything. By the time backup arrived, it was already too late. The Pentagon had been notified. And when you shoot a man who once saved 47 lives in Kabul, the military doesn't send lawyers. They send a message. This is what happened when Officer Brandon Cole made the worst decision of his career. The morning of December 18th, 2024, began like any other at Los Angeles Union Station. Commuters rushed through the historic terminal, their footsteps echoing against Art Deco walls that had witnessed a century of arrivals and departures. Holiday travelers dragged oversized suitcases. Business professionals clutched coffee cups like lifelines. Children pressed their faces against windows, watching trains glide into position. Nobody suspected that within the hour, those same marble floors would be stained with blood, and the station would become ground zero for a confrontation that would shake the foundations of law enforcement and military relations across the nation. Gate 7 stood near the eastern checkpoint, a security bottleneck where travelers queued impatiently, removing shoes and belts, emptying pockets into gray plastic bins. The December sun streamed through tall windows, casting long shadows across the security scanners. Officer Brandon Cole stood at his post, eyes scanning the crowd with practiced suspicion. At 32 years old, Cole had worked transit security for 7 years, transferred between 3 stations, each move quietly arranged after complaints that never quite made it into official reports. He had a particular way of seeing threats where others saw ordinary people. His hand rested habitually near his service weapon, fingers drumming against the holster like a gunfighter waiting for high noon. Beside him, Officer Jenny Park monitored the X-ray screens, her first month on the job still fresh with optimism and training manual protocols. She'd noticed Cole's demeanor, the way his jaw tightened when certain passengers approached. The subtle shift in his stance that spoke of judgment passed before words were even exchanged. She'd tried to rationalize it as experience, as instinct honed by years in the field, but something in her gut whispered otherwise. At 9:47 a.m., Marcus Hayes entered the security line. He moved with a particular kind of stillness, the sort that comes from years of training where unnecessary movement could mean death. At 49 years old, Marcus carried himself with quiet dignity, dressed in a worn leather jacket over a faded gray shirt, dark jeans, and scuffed boots that had walked through deserts most Americans couldn't locate on a map. His close-cropped hair showed gray at the temples. His eyes, deep brown and alert, scanned the terminal with the unconscious vigilance of someone who'd spent 2 decades assessing threats in hostile territory. In his backpack were simple things: a change of clothes, toiletries, a dog-eared paperback, protein bars for the train ride, and buried at the bottom, wrapped in a small velvet pouch he never opened anymore, a Medal of Honor he'd received in a ceremony he barely remembered, on a day that felt like it belonged to someone else's life. Marcus had served 23 years in the Marine Corps. His record was decorated with commendations most people would never see. Operations conducted in shadows, where success meant silence and failure meant body bags shipped home under cover of night. He'd led reconnaissance missions in Kandahar, extraction operations in Somalia, and a hostage rescue in Syria that saved 47 lives, including 2 American journalists and a congressman's daughter. That last mission had cost him 3 teammates, a shattered collarbone, and a piece of his soul. He'd never quite recovered. The brass had wanted to make him a hero. Photo ops, press conferences, the whole parade. But Marcus had stood in that Pentagon office and said 6 words that ended his public military career. "Sir, I just want to go home." They'd honored his request, mostly, gave him the medal in a private ceremony, let him fade into the quiet retirement he'd earned. He'd moved to a small apartment in Riverside, started teaching self-defense at the community center, spent weekends fishing and trying to remember what peace felt like. But 3 days ago, everything had changed. The message had come through an encrypted channel he'd been told would never activate again, a number that wasn't supposed to ring unless the world was ending or someone from his past needed an exit strategy. The text was brief, just 11 words that turned his blood cold. "Marcus, you were right about Tehran. They know. Get somewhere public. Now." Tehran. The word alone was enough to unlock memories he'd buried deep. 4 years ago, Marcus had been part of a classified task force investigating weapons trafficking through Iranian networks. They'd uncovered something bigger than guns, something that reached into corporate boardrooms and government offices, something that powerful people had wanted to stay buried. Marcus had compiled evidence, written reports that were supposed to go up the chain of command. Instead, they disappeared. His superior officer had looked him in the eye and said, "Drop it, Hayes, or you'll regret it." 2 weeks later, that same officer died in what was officially ruled a training accident. Marcus had dropped it. He'd taken his retirement and tried to forget. But someone, somewhere, hadn't forgotten him. The message meant they were coming. It meant whoever had buried the Tehran files knew that Marcus still had copies, still had proof, still had the kind of memory that could unravel carefully constructed lies. And it meant his quiet life in Riverside had just become a target. So Marcus had done what the message advised. He'd gone public. Union Station at rush hour, surrounded by witnesses and cameras, was about as public as it got. If they wanted him gone, they'd have to do it in front of thousands of people. He'd bought a train ticket to San Francisco, planning to stay with an old Marine buddy who had a cabin in the mountains, somewhere to lay low while he figured out his next move. He'd almost made it. As Marcus placed his backpack on the conveyor belt, his boots on the tray, his jacket in the bin, Brandon Cole's eyes locked onto him. There was something about the way Marcus moved, calm and controlled, that set off alarms in Cole's head. Not the kind of alarms trained officers recognize as genuine threats, but the kind born from bias and assumption, the kind that saw danger in confidence, threat in composure, especially when that composure came wrapped in brown skin. "Sir, step aside," Cole said, his voice sharp. Marcus looked up, meeting Cole's eyes with the steady gaze of someone who'd faced down armed insurgents and wasn't particularly intimidated by a transit cop with an attitude. "Is there a problem, officer?" "I said step aside, now." The scanner beeped. Marcus's boots had triggered the metal detector. He reached down calmly. "It's probably the steel toe. These are work boots. I can take them off again if you—" "Hands where I can see them!" Cole's hand moved to his weapon. The crowd around them slowed, phones emerging from pockets, that modern instinct to document everything. Jenny Park looked up from her screen, her stomach dropping. "Brandon, he's complying. He hasn't done anything." "Stay out of this, Park." Marcus raised his hands slowly, palms open. 23 years of training kicked in. De-escalate, stay calm. Don't give them a reason. His voice remained steady, almost gentle. "Officer, I'm a veteran. Marine Corps. I'm just trying to catch a train. Whatever you think is happening here, I promise you, it's not." But Cole heard defiance in that calm. He heard challenge in that steadiness. And beneath all his training, beneath all the protocols and procedures, an old, ugly fear took hold. "On the ground. Now." "Officer, I haven't—" "I said on the ground." Marcus began to lower himself, moving slowly, deliberately, telegraphing every motion. His hand brushed his jacket pocket, reaching for his phone, thinking if this was going to escalate, he needed his own recording, his own proof. That's when Brandon Cole fired. The first bullet caught Marcus in the shoulder, spinning him halfway around. The second hit his side. The third and fourth went wide as Marcus fell, his body hitting the marble with a sound that echoed through the suddenly silent terminal. Screams erupted, people scattered. A child's cry cut through the chaos. Marcus lay on the cold floor, blood pooling beneath him, and felt a strange sense of déjà vu. He'd been shot before, twice, actually, once in Fallujah and once in Mogadishu. He knew this feeling, the shock that came before pain, the odd clarity that accompanied trauma. His mind, trained by years of combat, began assessment protocols automatically. Shoulder wound, through and through. Side wound, possibly organ damage. Breathing difficult but possible. Vision clear. Heart rate elevated but steady. He could hear Cole shouting, panicked justifications already forming. "He reached for something. I saw a weapon he was reaching." Jenny Park's voice, shaking but firm. "He was reaching for his phone, Brandon, his phone. Oh, God, what did you do?" Marcus turned his head slightly, saw Jenny's smartwatch, saw the small red light that meant recording. Good. Evidence. Witnesses. Truth. His lips moved, blood on his teeth, and he whispered the words that had been drilled into him during his most classified briefings, the code phrase that would activate emergency protocols. "Tell General Whitmore I kept my promise." Jenny heard it, leaned closer. "What? Sir, stay still, help is coming." Marcus's hand, slick with blood, reached into his jacket and pulled out a small card, military ID from years ago, and pressed it into her palm. His eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Record everything. Hide nothing. Promise me." She nodded, tears streaming. "I promise." Paramedics rushed in, their boots squeaking on marble now slick with blood. They worked quickly, efficiently, shouting medical terminology that Marcus understood from his combat first aid training. One of them, a young woman with kind eyes, leaned close. "Sir, can you tell me your name?" "Hayes," he managed. "Sergeant Marcus Hayes, Marine Corps." Her hands froze for a fraction of a second. "You're military?" "Was." He coughed, tasted copper. 23 years. The lead paramedic looked up at Cole, who stood pale and shaking, weapons still drawn. "You shot a veteran?" Cole's mouth opened, closed. No words came. Outside, sirens wailed. Inside, Marcus felt consciousness sliding, that familiar darkness he'd fought before. But this time, he didn't fight it. This time he smiled. Because somewhere above him, protocols were activating. Somewhere in Virginia, a general's phone was ringing. Somewhere in the machinery of military justice, gears were beginning to turn. He'd kept his promise. The evidence was hidden, backed up, distributed to people who couldn't be silenced. And now, lying in his own blood on the floor of Union Station, Marcus Hayes had become something more useful than a whistleblower. He'd become a martyr. And martyrs, he knew, were the hardest truths to bury. Brandon Cole had always believed he was one of the good ones. That's what he told himself every morning when he strapped on his badge, every night when he came home to his empty apartment in Carson, every time someone questioned his judgment or challenged his authority. He wasn't racist, he insisted to himself, and anyone who'd listen. He was careful, observant, trained to spot threats that others missed. In his mind, the problem wasn't his perception. It was everyone else's inability to understand the dangers he faced daily, the split-second decisions required to keep people safe. His father had been LAPD, 30 years on the force, retired with full honors and a liver destroyed by decades of post-shift drinking. Brandon had grown up on stories of the old days, when cops were respected, when authority meant something, when you didn't have to apologize for doing your job. His father had taught him to trust his gut, to never back down, to understand that hesitation could get you killed. The world's divided into two types of people. Son, his father had said over countless backyard beers. Those who follow the rules, and those who prey on people who do. Your job is knowing the difference before they make their move. Brandon had absorbed those lessons like gospel. He'd joined transit security at 25, fresh from a 2-year criminal justice program, and burning with purpose. He was going to make a difference. He was going to be the shield between innocent travelers and the chaos that lurked in crowded spaces. He was going to prove himself worthy of the Cole family legacy. But the job had been harder than he'd expected. Not physically. Brandon could handle the long shifts, the monotonous routine of scanning bags and checking IDs. What he couldn't handle was the disrespect. The eye rolls when he asked someone to step aside for additional screening, the muttered complaints when he enforced protocols, the way people looked at him like he was the problem, like he was some glorified rent-a-cop playing dress-up instead of a legitimate law enforcement officer keeping them safe. His first complaint had come 6 months into the job. A middle-aged black woman accused him of racial profiling after he'd selected her for a random additional screening. Brandon had been genuinely shocked. Random meant random. The computer had flagged her, not him. But she'd made a scene, demanded his badge number, threatened legal action. His supervisor had taken him aside, suggested he be more mindful of optics, whatever that meant. The complaint had been filed, investigated, and ultimately dismissed. But it had left a mark. The second complaint came a year later. A Latino teenager with a backpack full of spray paint cans. Brandon had been certain the kid was up to something. Vandalism, maybe gang activity. He'd detained him for 45 minutes, called in backup, gone through every inch of that bag. The spray paint turned out to be for an art class. The kid's mother had filed a formal complaint, hired a lawyer, made noise. Again, nothing came of it officially. Again, Brandon was transferred to a different station. Again, he was told to be more conscious of community relations. The third complaint had been last year. An elderly Sikh man wearing a turban. Brandon had asked him to remove it for additional screening, citing security protocols. The man had tried to explain that his turban was a religious article, that removing it publicly would be deeply inappropriate. Brandon had insisted security first, sensitivity second. That one had made local news. That one had required his union rep. That one had resulted in mandatory diversity training that Brandon sat through with crossed arms and a clenched jaw, convinced that political correctness was destroying law enforcement from within. Each transfer, each complaint, each mandatory training session had hardened something inside Brandon. He wasn't wrong. They were. He wasn't biased. They were oversensitive. He wasn't the problem. The system that tied his hands and second-guessed every decision was the problem. He started spending more time on online forums where other officers shared his frustrations, where people understood that the real threat wasn't misconduct, but the inability to properly address genuine dangers because someone might cry discrimination. By the time he landed at Union Station 3 months ago, Brandon Cole had built an impenetrable wall of self-justification around every action, every instinct, every fear, masquerading as vigilance. He'd convinced himself that his pattern of complaints wasn't evidence of bias, but proof that he was willing to do what others wouldn't, that he saw threats others ignored, that he had the courage to act when others hesitated. Which brought him to December 18th, 2024. Gate 7, 9:47 a.m. The morning had been routine until Marcus Hayes entered his line. Brandon spotted him immediately. Something about the way the man moved, controlled, and aware set off warning bells. The leather jacket looked worn. The boots looked military. The calm expression looked rehearsed. Brandon had seen that look before, or thought he had. In 100 training videos about concealed threats and dangerous individuals who blended into crowds. When the scanner beeped, Brandon's hand had moved instinctively toward his weapon. He told himself it was protocol. He told himself any reasonable officer would be cautious. He told himself the man's calm demeanor was suspicious, not compliant. Criminals acted calm, too. Terrorists stayed composed. You couldn't trust surface appearances. "Sir, step aside," Brandon had said, his voice harder than necessary, establishing authority. The man had looked at him with eyes that held no fear, only assessment, and that lack of fear felt like disrespect, like challenge. When he'd mentioned work boots, offered to remove them again, Brandon heard manipulation. When he'd said he was a veteran, Brandon heard a con. Anyone could claim military service. Anyone could fake that disciplined posture. Then the man's hand had moved toward his pocket. In that fraction of a second, everything Brandon had been taught, everything he'd convinced himself was true, everything his father had warned him about, it all collapsed into a single, terrible certainty. Threat, weapon, danger. The training videos played in his head. Hesitation kills, trust your gut, better judged by 12 than carried by 6. His hand closed around his service weapon, drew, aimed, fired. The first shot felt like vindication. The second felt like confirmation. The third and fourth felt like panic because the man was falling, but nothing had exploded, no weapon had appeared, no threat had materialized beyond his own imagination. Marcus hit the ground, and reality crashed over Brandon like ice water. There was no gun, no knife, no threat. Just a man bleeding on marble floors, surrounded by screaming travelers and the deafening silence of his own catastrophic mistake. "He reached for something!" Brandon heard himself shouting, constructing the narrative even as his hands trembled. "I saw a weapon! He was reaching!" But even as the words left his mouth, some small buried part of Brandon Cole knew they were lies. Knew that what he'd seen as a threat was simply a man reaching for his phone. Knew that what he'd interpreted as danger was just his own fear, his own bias, his own inability to see a black man's confidence as anything other than threat. Jenny Park had been a transit security officer for exactly 27 days. She'd taken the job after 3 years of working retail at the Glendale Galleria, tired of folding clothes and dealing with entitled customers who treated service workers like furniture. Security work paid better, offered benefits, and came with a sense of purpose. She was protecting people, making a difference, contributing to public safety. Her training had been thorough. 2 weeks of classroom instruction, extensive protocols on screening procedures, conflict de-escalation techniques, and very clear guidelines on when weapon use was justified. Her instructors had emphasized proportional response, situational awareness, and the absolute necessity of exhausting all alternatives before resorting to force. Jenny had memorized every protocol. She'd aced every exam. She'd been genuinely excited to start her first assignment at Union Station, one of Los Angeles's busiest transit hubs. She'd imagined helping lost travelers, catching actual smugglers, being part of something bigger than herself. What she hadn't been prepared for was Brandon Cole. She'd noticed something off about him from her first shift. The way his jaw tightened when certain passengers approached. The way his eyes lingered on some people longer than others. The pattern wasn't random, and it wasn't based on behavior. It was based on appearance. She'd wanted to believe she was imagining it, that her 27 days of experience weren't enough to judge someone with 7 years in the field. But her Apple Watch had become an unintentional record of her discomfort. She'd developed a nervous habit of tapping it when tension rose, when situations felt wrong, when that small voice in her head whispered that something bad was about to happen. The watch's video recording feature, meant for capturing workout selfies and quick voice memos, had accidentally documented 6 incidents over 3 weeks where Brandon had detained or harassed travelers who all shared one thing in common. They weren't white. Jenny hadn't known what to do with those recordings. Reporting a senior officer during her probationary period felt like career suicide, but doing nothing felt like complicity. She'd been paralyzed between self-preservation and conscience, telling herself she needed more evidence, more certainty, more courage. Then Marcus Hayes walked through Gate 7, and all her hesitation crystallized into horror. She'd been monitoring the X-ray screen when she heard Brandon's voice sharpen. "Sir, step aside." That tone, she recognized it now, the edge that preceded escalation. She looked up. Saw a middle-aged black man in a leather jacket, calm and compliant, hands visible, posture non-threatening. Saw absolutely nothing that justified Brandon's aggressive stance. Her thumb found her watch, the familiar nervous tap. But this time, she pressed deliberately, record, just in case. "Is there a problem, officer?" the man asked, his voice remarkably steady. Brandon's hand moved toward his weapon, and Jenny's stomach dropped. "Brandon, he's complying. He hasn't done anything. Stay out of this, Park." The words hit her like a slap. She watched the man slowly raise his hands, watched him try to de-escalate, watched him mention being a veteran with such genuine dignity that tears pricked her eyes. This wasn't a threat. This was a human being trying to catch a train. "On the ground. Now." Jenny opened her mouth to speak, to object, to do something, but fear choked her words. She was 27 days into this job. Brandon had years of experience, union backing, authority she couldn't challenge. Who would believe her over him? Then the man's hand brushed his jacket, a simple gesture toward his phone, and Jenny saw Brandon's finger move on the trigger. "No," she started to say. The gunshots were deafening, 4 thunderclaps that turned the busy terminal into a scene of screaming chaos. The man fell. Blood spread. And Jenny stood frozen, her watch still recording, her mind unable to process what she'd just witnessed. She heard Brandon shouting justifications. "He reached for something. I saw a weapon." But Jenny had seen everything, had watched the entire encounter, had recorded every second, and she knew with absolute certainty that what Brandon claimed was a lie. The man on the ground turned his head, blood on his lips, and whispered something. Jenny moved closer without thinking, kneeling beside him as paramedics rushed in. His hand pressed something into her palm, a military ID card, and his eyes locked onto hers with desperate intensity. "Record everything. Hide nothing. Promise me." The weight of that moment crashed over her. This man, bleeding from wounds that might kill him, wasn't thinking about himself. He was thinking about truth, about evidence, about making sure what happened here couldn't be buried or rewritten. Jenny clutched the ID card and nodded through tears. "I promise." As paramedics worked on Marcus, as Brandon stood pale and shaking nearby, as dozens of civilian phones captured different angles of the aftermath, Jenny made a decision that would define the rest of her life. She tapped her watch, stopped the recording, and immediately synced it to her encrypted cloud storage. Then she sent copies to 3 different email addresses: her personal account, her sister who was a paralegal, and a local civil rights organization she'd researched after her first uncomfortable shift with Brandon. She labeled each file with the date, time, and location. She wrote a brief description. "Officer involved shooting, victim unarmed and compliant, full encounter recorded." Her hands shook as she hit send. 27 days on the job, and she'd just ended her career. She'd just made herself a target. She'd just chosen conscience over comfort, truth over self-preservation. But as she looked at Marcus Hayes, this veteran who'd served his country and been shot for the crime of being calm and black in a security checkpoint, Jenny knew she'd made the only choice her conscience could live with. The recording was out there now. The truth was documented. And whatever came next, she'd face it knowing she'd kept her promise to a dying man who'd asked her for one simple thing. Don't let them bury this. The blood pooled faster than anyone expected. Marcus Hayes lay on the cold marble of Union Station, his breathing shallow and labored, while chaos erupted around him like a storm breaking against shore. The terminal that had been filled with holiday travelers and morning commuters now resembled a war zone. People screamed, scrambled for exits, pressed themselves against walls. Parents covered their children's eyes. A coffee cart lay overturned, brown liquid mixing with red on the pristine floor. And through it all, dozens of phones remained raised, recording, documenting, bearing witness to what would become one of the most viral incidents of police violence in recent history. The first paramedic team arrived within 4 minutes. Station 9 had been only 6 blocks away when the call came through. Lead paramedic Sarah Chen hit the ground running, her partner Miguel Rodriguez right behind her, equipment bags swinging. They'd responded to hundreds of emergencies, but something about this one made Sarah's chest tighten before she even saw the victim. Gunshot victim, multiple wounds. Male, approximately 50 years old, dispatch had said. What dispatch hadn't said was that half the terminal would be filming, that the shooter would still be standing there with his weapon drawn, or that the victim would be the calmest person in the entire scene. Sarah dropped to her knees beside Marcus, her hands already moving through assessment protocols. "Sir, can you hear me? I'm Sarah. I'm a paramedic. We're going to help you." Marcus's eyes opened, surprisingly clear despite the blood loss. "I can hear you." His voice was steady, almost conversational, the kind of control Sarah had only seen in combat veterans who'd been through trauma before. "Can you tell me your name?" "Hayes. Sergeant Marcus Hayes, Marine Corps." He coughed, winced. "Retired." Miguel was already cutting away Marcus's jacket, exposing the shoulder wound. "Entry and exit. Shoulder. Clean through. Second wound, left side, possible organ involvement. BP is dropping. We need to move fast." Sarah applied pressure to the side wound, while Miguel started an IV line. Around them, transit police were trying to establish a perimeter, pushing back the crowd, shouting at people to put their phones away. But nobody was listening. If anything, more phones appeared. "You're military?" Sarah asked, keeping Marcus engaged, aware. "Standard protocol for trauma patients. Keep them talking, keep them conscious." 23 years? Marcus smiled, blood on his teeth. "Ironic, isn't it? Survived Fallujah, Kandahar, Syria. Get shot in a train station in Los Angeles." "Don't talk like that. You're going to be fine." But Marcus shook his head slightly. "Listen to me carefully. My name is Sergeant Marcus Hayes, service number 2847539. I was unarmed. I was compliant. And I need you to make sure General David Whitmore at the Pentagon knows what happened here. Can you remember that?" Sarah glanced at Miguel, who looked equally confused. "Sir, right now we need to focus on General David Whitmore. Pentagon. Tell him I kept my promise." Marcus's hand, slick with blood, gripped Sarah's wrist with surprising strength. "This isn't just a shooting. There are people who need to know I'm down. People who will come. Tell them I kept my promise." The intensity in his eyes made Sarah's skin prickle. This wasn't shock-talking. This wasn't delirium. This was a man delivering a message he considered more important than his own survival. "I'll tell them," she promised. "But right now, you need to let us work." 20 feet away, Officer Brandon Cole stood frozen. His weapon finally holstered, but his hands still shaking. Fellow officers had arrived, were asking him questions, but their words sounded like they were coming through water. Everything felt distant, unreal, like he was watching himself from outside his body. "Brandon, what happened?" Lieutenant Morrison was asking for the third time. He reached. I thought there was something." The narrative he'd shouted moments ago was already crumbling in his mind. What had he seen exactly? A hand moving toward a pocket? A man checking his phone? The truth and the justification were tangling together, becoming indistinguishable. Jenny Park stood nearby, her face pale, her watch still warm against her wrist from the recording that had just ended. She watched Brandon trying to construct his story. Watched other officers already forming ranks around him, that blue wall rising brick by brick. She'd seen it in her training videos, been warned about it by friends who'd left law enforcement. The system protects its own, even when its own are wrong. Lieutenant Morrison turned to her. "Park, what did you see?" This was it, the moment, the choice that would define everything that came after. Jenny could feel Brandon's eyes on her, feel the weight of 7 years of experience and union backing pressing down. She could say she wasn't sure, that everything happened so fast, that Brandon had followed protocol. It would be easier, safer, career-protecting. Instead, she heard herself say, he was reaching for his phone. The victim was compliant. No weapon, no threat. Officer Cole fired without justification. The silence that followed was deafening. Brandon's face went from pale to red. "What the hell, Park? You don't know what you're talking about." "I recorded it," Jenny interrupted, her voice shaking but clear. "The whole thing. From the moment the victim entered the checkpoint until Officer Cole fired. It's already uploaded to cloud storage and sent to multiple recipients. The victim was unarmed and compliant." Morrison's expression hardened. "You recorded a fellow officer without authorization?" "I recorded a shooting, sir." "That's unauthorized surveillance of law enforcement operations. That's evidence," Jenny finished. "And it's already out there." And it was. By the time Marcus was loaded onto the stretcher and wheeled toward the ambulance, the first clips were already appearing on Twitter. A tourist from Japan had captured the shooting from behind a pillar. A businessman had filmed from the coffee stand. A teenager had streamed the entire aftermath live on TikTok. But Jenny's video was different. Jenny's video had audio, had angle, had context. It showed Marcus's face, his calm compliance, his gentle attempt to de-escalate. It showed Brandon's aggression, his weapon drawn before any threat materialized. It showed the exact moment an unarmed veteran was shot for the crime of reaching for his phone. The video landed in an encrypted email to the Los Angeles chapter of the NAACP at 10:03 a.m. By 10:15, their legal team had verified its authenticity and forwarded it to national media outlets. By 10:30, CNN had it. By 10:45, it was everywhere. The hashtag #MarcusHayes began trending at 10:52 a.m. By 11 a.m., it was the #1 trending topic in the United States, and at 11:07 a.m., a secure line rang in the Pentagon. General David Whitmore was in a classified briefing about Middle Eastern logistics when his personal phone vibrated with a code he hadn't seen in 4 years. Priority Alpha, Emergency Protocol. He'd helped design that system. It was meant for catastrophic scenarios, for when someone from his old task force needed immediate extraction, or when classified operations went sideways. He excused himself from the briefing, stepped into the secure corridor, and answered. "Whitmore. General, this is Agent Patterson, DOD Security. We have a situation. Sergeant Marcus Hayes has been shot. Los Angeles Union Station, multiple gunshot wounds. He's being transported to Cedars-Sinai Medical Center. Local police are treating it as an officer-involved shooting." The world tilted. Whitmore gripped the phone tighter. "Marcus Hayes, you're certain?" Positive ID confirmed through facial recognition and witness statements. "Sir, he apparently asked paramedics to contact you specifically. He said, and I quote, Tell General Whitmore I kept my promise. Those words hit Whitmore like a physical blow. I kept my promise. That was the phrase. The code. The activation sequence they'd agreed on 4 years ago when Marcus had walked away from the Tehran investigation, when powerful people had wanted him silenced, when Whitmore had promised that if anything ever happened, the full weight of military justice would respond. What's his condition? Critical but stable. 2 gunshot wounds. 1 shoulder, 1 torso. He's in surgery now. Who shot him? Transit Security Officer. Officer Brandon Cole. Sir, there's video. Multiple videos. It's already viral. The victim was unarmed and compliant. This is bad. Whitmore's jaw clenched. Marcus Hayes had saved 47 lives in Syria, had served with distinction for 23 years, had uncovered corruption that reached into the highest levels of defense contracting, had walked away quietly when asked, taking his evidence with him as insurance, as protection, and now some trigger-happy cop had shot him in a train station. Activate Protocol Redstone, Whitmore said, his voice cold as winter steel. Full military response. I want security details at that hospital. I want every piece of evidence secured. I want the Justice Department notified, and I want eyes on Officer Cole. Nobody talks to him without our lawyers present. Sir, the local police aren't going to I don't care what they like. Marcus Hayes is a decorated Marine with active security clearances related to classified operations. This is now a federal matter involving military personnel and national security. If the LAPD has a problem with that, they can call the Attorney General. Whitmore hung up and immediately made 3 more calls. First, to the Judge Advocate General's office. Second, to the Defense Department's Office of Inspector General. Third, to his old commander, now a 2-star general at Fort Irwin, who'd served with Marcus in Kandahar. Within 12 minutes, orders were flowing through military channels. Within 20 minutes, a military convoy was assembling at Fort MacArthur in San Pedro. Within 30 minutes, 2 Black Hawk helicopters lifted off from the base, rotors thundering, heading north toward downtown Los Angeles. At Union Station, Lieutenant Morrison was still trying to process Jenny Park's confession about the recording when he heard the sound. Low at first, distant, but growing louder. The distinctive thump-thump-thump of military helicopters. He stepped outside and looked up. 2 Black Hawks circled Union Station once, then descended toward the parking structure. Behind them, visible down Alameda Street, a convoy of black SUVs and military vehicles approached, lights flashing. "What the hell?" Morrison whispered. The helicopters landed, and men in military police uniforms emerged, moving with practiced efficiency. A moment later, a black SUV screeched to a stop, and 3 men in dress uniforms stepped out. The lead officer, a full-bird colonel with more ribbons than Morrison had ever seen in person, walked directly toward him. "I'm Colonel James Reeves, United States Marine Corps. I'm here regarding the shooting of Sergeant Marcus Hayes. Which one of you is Officer Cole?" Brandon stepped forward, still pale, still shaking. I'm Cole." Reeves looked at him with an expression that could freeze lava. "You are not to give any statements to local law enforcement without presence of military legal counsel. You are not to leave this jurisdiction. You are not to discuss this incident with anyone except through official legal channels. Do you understand?" I don't work for the military. You can't." Sergeant Hayes holds active security clearances related to classified military operations. Your shooting of him has triggered federal jurisdiction under the Uniform Code of Military Justice as it pertains to crimes against military personnel. The FBI is being notified. The Justice Department is being notified. And I guarantee you, Officer Cole, that every single frame of video from this station is now evidence in a federal investigation. Morrison found his voice. Colonel, with all due respect, this is a local matter. LAPD has jurisdiction. Not anymore. Reeves handed him a document. Federal warrant. Signed by a district judge 20 minutes ago. All evidence related to this shooting is now under federal custody pending investigation. That includes security footage, witness statements, and Officer Cole's service weapon. Brandon's hand instinctively moved toward his holster. I wouldn't do that, Reeves said quietly. Surrender your weapon. Now. The next 15 minutes were a blur of military efficiency. Federal agents secured the scene. Military police collected evidence. A JAG attorney arrived and immediately separated Brandon from his fellow officers. Jenny Park found herself escorted to a quiet office where a kind-faced woman in a naval officer's uniform asked her gently but thoroughly to describe everything she'd seen. Outside, news helicopters circled, capturing footage of military vehicles surrounding Union Station. The story was evolving in real time. Decorated Marine shot, by police at train station. Military mobilizes. Pentagon intervenes. Videos from civilians showed the shooting from multiple angles. Jenny's recording, now in federal custody, provided the complete picture. At Cedars-Sinai Medical Center, another military convoy established a perimeter around the surgical wing. General Whitmore himself arrived at 12:47 p.m., walking past stunned hospital security into the restricted area where Marcus Hayes fought for his life. The surgeon, Dr. Patel, met him outside the operating room. He's stable. We removed the bullet from his torso. Missed his liver by 2 centimeters. The shoulder wound was clean through. He's incredibly lucky. Can I see him? Not yet. He's in recovery. But General... Dr. Patel hesitated. Before we put him under, he kept repeating something about a promise, about files. He seemed very insistent that you would understand. Whitmore nodded slowly. He understood perfectly. Marcus Hayes had just become the most protected witness in America. And somewhere, in encrypted storage, evidence that powerful people had tried to bury was about to come to light. Because Marcus hadn't just kept his promise. He'd made sure his shooting would expose everything. The investigation moved with the speed and precision of a military operation, because that's exactly what it was. Within 72 hours of Marcus Hayes being shot at Union Station, 3 separate investigations had been launched. A Department of Justice civil rights probe, a military inspector general inquiry into potential obstruction of classified investigations, and an FBI task force examining the Tehran weapons trafficking case that Marcus had tried to expose 4 years earlier. The shooting of a decorated Marine had ripped open a wound that powerful people had spent years trying to keep closed. Brandon Cole discovered very quickly that shooting Marcus Hayes was the worst mistake of his life. On December 20th, 48 hours after the shooting, Brandon sat in a small interrogation room at the FBI field office in Los Angeles. His union lawyer, Tom Beckett, sat beside him looking increasingly uncomfortable. Across the table sat 2 federal agents and a military JAG attorney whose expression suggested she'd rather be prosecuting war criminals but would settle for a trigger-happy transit cop. "Let's go through this one more time," Agent Sarah Morrison said, sliding a tablet across the table. On the screen, Jenny Park's recording played in crystal-clear detail. "Tell me where you see a weapon." Brandon watched himself on screen, watched Marcus Hayes raise his hand slowly, watched his own hand move toward his holster. He was reaching for his phone. Morrison interrupted. "We recovered his phone from the scene. It's right here in evidence. No weapon was found. No knife. No gun. Nothing that could be construed as a threat. So I'll ask you again. What exactly did you see that justified lethal force?" Brandon's mouth went dry. He'd been over this 100 times in his head, trying to reconstruct the moment, trying to find the threat he'd been so certain existed. But every time he watched the video, all he saw was a calm, compliant man trying to catch a train. His demeanor, the way he moved, my training. "Your training." The JAG attorney, Captain Linda Morrison, leaned forward. "Let's talk about your training. You've had 3 prior complaints for racial profiling. You've been through mandatory sensitivity training twice. You were transferred from 2 previous stations due to incidents involving excessive force allegations. And yet here you are, having shot an unarmed black veteran who was fully compliant with your instructions. So either your training is severely deficient, or you chose to ignore it. Which is it?" Tom Beckett raised a hand. "My client was following departmental protocols for threat assessment." "Your client violated every single protocol," Morrison shot back. She pulled out a thick binder. "Use of force continuum. Let's review. Verbal commands, yes, Officer Cole gave those. Subject complied, yes." Sergeant Hayes raised his hands and attempted to explain. "De-escalation attempted, no. Additional verbal warnings, no. Non-lethal force options, not utilized. Immediate escalation to lethal force against an unarmed, compliant subject. Yes." "Do you see the problem here, Mr. Beckett?" The lawyer shifted uncomfortably. He'd been defending cops for 20 years, had seen plenty of gray areas, plenty of split-second decisions that could go either way. This wasn't one of them. This was indefensible. And everyone in the room knew it. Agent Morrison pulled up another video. "This is security footage from 3 weeks ago. Officer Cole, same station, same checkpoint. Can you tell me what you see?" Brandon watched himself stop an elderly Latina woman, demand additional screening, search through her bags with an aggression that looked excessive even to him. That was a random screening. Except our analysis shows that 93% of your random screenings over the past 3 months involved people of color. 93%, Officer Cole. That's not random. That's a pattern. And patterns establish intent. The room fell silent except for the hum of the air conditioning. Brandon felt the walls closing in. Everything he'd told himself, that he was just being careful, that he was doing his job, that other people were too sensitive. All of it was crumbling under the weight of actual evidence. "Here's what's going to happen," Captain Morrison said, her voice cold and precise. "The Department of Justice is filing federal civil rights charges. You're looking at deprivation of rights under color of law, which carries up to 10 years. The district attorney is filing state charges for assault with a deadly weapon and attempted murder. And because Sergeant Hayes holds active security clearances related to classified military operations, there's an argument to be made for federal terrorism charges related to interference with a protected federal witness." Brandon's face went white. "Terrorism? That's insane. Is it?" Morrison pulled out another document. "Sergeant Hayes was the primary witness in an ongoing investigation into weapons trafficking involving defense contractors and foreign governments. 4 years ago, he compiled evidence of corruption that implicated several high-ranking officials. He was told to drop the investigation. He complied, but he kept his evidence as insurance. 3 days before you shot him, he received a credible threat. He went to a public place specifically to avoid being disappeared. And then you shot him. So either you're the unluckiest cop in America, or somebody wanted him silenced and you were convenient. That's crazy, Brandon whispered. Nobody told me to. I didn't know anything about. We believe you, Agent Morrison said. We don't think you were part of any conspiracy. We think you're exactly what you appear to be, a racist cop who saw a black man and manufactured a threat that didn't exist. But the effect is the same. You tried to kill a federal witness, and whether you knew it or not, you're now part of something much bigger than a bad shooting. Tom Beckett closed his briefcase. I need to speak with my client privately. Take all the time you need, Captain Morrison said, standing. But understand this, Mr. Beckett, the only question now is whether your client cooperates or fights. If he cooperates, pleads guilty, shows genuine remorse, maybe he's looking at 8 to 10 years with possibility of parole. If he fights, if he tries to justify this, if he makes Sergeant Hayes relive this trauma in court, we'll push for the maximum on every charge, 20 years minimum. And we'll make sure every single incident from his past, every complaint, every transfer, every racist comment he's ever made gets entered into evidence. His entire career will be dissected in public. Do you understand? Beckett nodded slowly. He understood perfectly. Brandon Cole's life as he knew it was over. Jenny Park sat in a coffee shop in Silver Lake watching the news coverage on her laptop while nursing her third latte of the day. She'd been placed on administrative leave pending the investigation. Standard procedure, they'd told her. Nothing to worry about. But she wasn't worried about the investigation. She was worried about the death threats. They'd started within hours of her name being leaked. Someone in the department, some thin blue-line loyalist who thought she'd betrayed the badge, had posted her name and photo on a police officer forum. Within a day, she'd received hundreds of messages. Traitor, rat, backstabber. Some were worse, explicit threats about what would happen to cops who snitched on other cops. She'd changed her phone number twice, deleted all her social media, and moved out of her apartment to stay with her sister. But she'd also received other messages from civil rights organizations thanking her for her courage, from veterans groups praising her integrity, from ordinary people who said she'd restored their faith that good cops existed. The local NAACP had offered her legal support. A prominent civil rights attorney had called to say she'd represent Jenny pro bono if the department tried to retaliate. Most surprisingly, she'd received a handwritten letter, delivered through military channels, from Marcus Hayes himself. She pulled it from her bag now, unfolding the careful script on official Marine Corps stationery. She'd read it a dozen times, but the words still moved her. Officer Park, I'm told you made a choice that day that saved my life in ways beyond the medical. You chose truth over comfort, integrity over convenience. You kept a promise to a stranger when staying silent would have been easier. That kind of courage is rare, and I want you to know it matters. I've been a Marine for 23 years. I've served with people who wore medals they didn't earn and people who earned medals they never wore. The ones I respected most were the ones who did the right thing even when it cost them something, especially when it cost them something. You're going to face consequences for what you did. People will call you a traitor. They'll say you broke the code, that you don't belong in law enforcement. They're wrong. You're exactly what law enforcement needs. Officers who understand that the badge is a responsibility, not a shield for misconduct. I'm recovering well. The doctors say I'll make a full recovery, though I'll have some impressive scars to add to my collection. I've been in contact with federal investigators about the Tehran files I've been protecting. Your recording didn't just save my life. It gave me the platform to finally expose the corruption I've been sitting on for 4 years. Sometimes the worst thing that happens to you becomes the catalyst for the best thing you can do. I got shot. But because I got shot, and because you had the courage to document it, we're about to take down some very bad people who've been hiding behind uniforms and clearances for too long. I don't know what your future holds, but I know this. You have the heart of a warrior and the integrity of a saint. Whatever path you choose, you'll excel at it, because you've already proven you have what it takes to stand alone when it matters most. Stay strong, Officer Park. The good guys don't always win immediately, but they win eventually. And you're one of the good guys. Semper Fidelis, Sergeant Marcus Hayes, USMC, Red. Jenny folded the letter carefully and tucked it back into her bag. The investigation would conclude soon. She'd probably lose her job. The Transit Authority had made it clear that unauthorized recording of fellow officers was grounds for termination, regardless of what that recording revealed. But she was okay with that. She'd already had offers from private security firms who valued integrity. A veterans organization had asked if she'd be interested in running their security training program, and the ACLU had reached out about a position in their police accountability division. Losing her job didn't feel like losing. It felt like graduating to something better. 6 weeks after the shooting, Marcus Hayes stood before a Senate subcommittee in Washington, D.C., his left arm still in a sling, his testimony being broadcast live to millions of Americans. Senator Patricia Williams leaned forward, her reading glasses perched on her nose. Sergeant Hayes, you've provided this committee with extensive documentation of a weapons trafficking operation that allegedly involves defense contractors, foreign governments, and members of our own military. Can you explain why you waited 4 years to come forward with this evidence? Marcus adjusted the microphone. His voice was calm, measured, carrying the weight of a man who'd rehearsed this moment for years. Senator, I didn't wait. I reported my findings through proper channels to my commanding officer 4 years ago. I was told to drop the investigation. When I persisted, I was told that pursuing it would be career-limiting and potentially dangerous. 2 weeks later, my commanding officer died in what was ruled a training accident. I got the message. So you buried it. No, Senator. I secured it. I made copies. I distributed them to trusted sources with instructions to release everything if anything happened to me. I became insurance. As long as I stayed quiet and stayed alive, the evidence stayed buried. But if they came for me, if they tried to silence me, the truth would come out. And then Officer Cole shot you. Marcus smiled faintly. Officer Cole did me a favor, though I doubt he sees it that way. By shooting me in a crowded train station in front of cameras with a recording that proved I was unarmed and compliant, he created a spotlight too bright for anyone to hide in. Suddenly, I wasn't just a retired Marine making allegations. I was a victim, a veteran shot by police for no reason. And when the Pentagon mobilized to protect me, when the media started asking why a Marine sergeant warranted that level of response, the questions I'd been waiting 4 years to answer finally got asked. Senator Williams shuffled papers. The evidence you've provided shows systematic corruption in defense contracts worth over $2 billion. It implicates 3 contractors, 2 congressional staffers, and at least 1 colonel in the procurement division. If verified, this could be the largest military corruption scandal in decades. It's all verified, Senator. Bank records, emails, recorded conversations. I didn't just collect evidence, I documented everything. I wanted to make sure that when this finally came to light, there would be no ambiguity, no plausible deniability. No way for anyone to claim it was just allegations from a disgruntled employee. Why didn't you go to the media 4 years ago? Marcus was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. Because I'm a Marine, Senator. Marines don't go to the media. We follow the chain of command. We trust the system. And when the system fails, we hope it eventually corrects itself. I was wrong about that. The system doesn't correct itself. People correct it. People like Officer Jenny Park, who chose truth over loyalty. People like General Whitmore, who honored his promise to protect those who serve with integrity. People like the federal agents who took my evidence seriously, instead of trying to bury it again. Senator Williams removed her glasses. Sergeant Hayes, one final question. Officer Brandon Cole shot you 4 times. You nearly died. You spent 3 weeks in the hospital and you'll be in physical therapy for months. Do you feel any animosity toward him? The room went quiet. Cameras zoomed in on Marcus's face. He took a breath, and when he spoke, his voice carried no anger, only a profound sadness. I feel sorry for him. Officer Cole isn't some monster. He's a product of a system that teaches fear instead of understanding, that values control over compassion, that sees skin color as a threat indicator. He made a terrible choice, and he'll pay for it. But the real tragedy is that his training, his background, his entire career led him to that moment. We can punish Officer Cole. We should punish him, but if we don't fix the system that created him, there will be another officer in another city making the same terrible choice next week. So, what do you recommend? I recommend we start valuing people over procedures. I recommend we train officers to see citizens as humans, not threats. I recommend we stop protecting bad cops and start celebrating good ones like Officer Park. And I recommend we remember that the badge is supposed to be a symbol of protection, not power. When we forget that, people like me get shot in train stations for the crime of existing while black. The Senate chamber erupted in applause. Not polite political applause, but genuine emotional appreciation for a man who'd turned his trauma into testimony, his victimization into validation for millions who'd experienced similar injustice. 3 months later, Brandon Cole stood before a judge in federal court and pleaded guilty to deprivation of rights under color of law. He received 8 years in federal prison with the possibility of parole after 5. His statement to the court was brief. I was wrong. I let fear control me. I saw a threat that didn't exist because I wanted to see it. Sergeant Hayes deserved better. The community deserved better. I'm sorry. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough, but it was honest. Jenny Park accepted a position as Director of Ethics and Training for the Los Angeles Police Commission's new Oversight Division. Her first initiative, mandatory implicit bias, testing for all officers, with body camera requirements for every public interaction. Some called her a radical. Others called her a reformer. She called herself someone who kept her promises. And Marcus Hayes. He returned to his quiet apartment in Riverside, picked up his fishing rod, and tried to remember what peace felt like. The physical scars would fade, the emotional ones would take longer, but he'd done what he set out to do. He'd exposed the corruption, he'd kept his promise, and he'd survived. Sometimes survival isn't about avoiding the bullet. Sometimes it's about making sure that when the bullet comes, you've already set things in motion that the bullet can't stop. Marcus Hayes had been shot for being black in America, but he'd turned that shooting into a reckoning that would echo for years. And that, he thought, casting his line into quiet water, was a victory worth bleeding for. Marcus Hayes survived 4 bullets because truth outlasts violence. Jenny Park lost her job but kept her integrity. Brandon Cole lost his freedom but found his conscience. These stories matter because they're real, reminding us that heroes make the right choice even when it costs everything. If this moved you, share it. Keep the conversation going. Want more stories about truth, justice, and impossible choices? Hit subscribe. Every week, we bring you real stories that keep you up at night, stories that matter. This is Untold Stories. Stay vigilant, stay informed, stay human.